Hey there! I thought today we would do something quite different, and this is something I got a couple of requests for this. People have asked me this a number of times, so I thought I would do this. Now, again, this is not for everyone, but I thought it might be interesting to at least some of you. The question today is, what's it like to be a professor? Good question. But first we have to, and I'll keep this really short, make a little bit of a distinction. What a professor is varies from country to country, okay? And then it also varies on what type of institution you're in. So at a university in the United Kingdom, typically you have 3 levels: lecturer, senior lecturer, and full professor. And only at the top level you are a professor. In my country too, universitair docent, universitair hoofddocent, professor, hoogleraar. In North America, things are a little different. You have assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. Those 3 things have professor in the name. Okay? So it's always a little different. In my country, only a full professor is called professor. Having said all that, I'm none of those things. Okay? These are basically research positions. And what I now have is a teaching position. I work at a college. I'm a college professor. My institution doesn't have assistant associate professor. It calls everyone instructor. Okay? Some colleges are different. Now, because instructor and college professor are kind of used interchangeably, just for the sake of argument, I'll be talking about college professor. What's the difference? Quite a big difference in my mind. At a university, typically, whatever level you're at, right, your main mandate is to do research with a bit of teaching. But as a college instructor or a college professor, my mandate is to do teaching with a bit of research. And at a university, I was always evaluated on, well, I have worked at different universities, I was always evaluated on my research output. And teaching was like, oh, you've also done some teaching, that's great. Now, I am more evaluated on my teaching output, and research matters. I am evaluated on my research output, but my main duties are teaching. This is called a TAM, and it is beautiful and very hot. I'm taking that off. So, important. So what I'll be talking about is not assistant, associate, full professor. I'm talking about college professor. And I want to stick to, as general, an overview of what it means to be college professor as possible. And I have to mention my institution a couple times, but I don't want to talk about my institution because then this becomes very specific. I would like this to be a more general video. Okay? So that's pretty much it. So what do I like? What do I not like about being a college professor? Well, basically from my first week at University of Amsterdam, started to study psychology. I was taught by a professor and I thought that is incredibly cool. So I learned, if you want to do this, you have to obtain a PhD. It's a long journey. In my case, 3 years bachelor, 2 years master's, 5 years PhD, 1 year postdoc. Like it's a lot. But then you could have a job like that. We'll get to you could have a job like that, as opposed to you will have a job like that. I did a video a while back on what to expect when you're about to embark on obtaining a PhD. So I don't want to talk about that now. That's all out of the way. What does it mean to do this? What do I do during a day? What do I like about it? Okay. There's a couple of things I really like about this job. So I teach at a college. That college is becoming a university, which is very exciting. I'm a psychologist. I teach psychology. But I think a lot of the principles I mention are generally applicable. So the first thing that I find incredibly interesting about this job is that it is intellectually stimulating. Why? Well, because I get paid to learn and then pass on that learning to other people, right? Now, of course, I already know a bunch of the stuff, right? I mean, I know, like, I have a PhD in cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience. I know a lot of the stuff, but nobody knows everything. So often when you are teaching, when you're preparing your courses, I have a course load of 4, so I teach 4 courses at the same time, which is another good illustration. At university, I taught 1 course at a time. But then I was mainly a researcher who did some teaching. Now I'm a teacher who does some research. So now I teach 4 courses at the same time. And when you do that, you prepare and you read the textbook and you prepare your stuff and you do all that, right? You prepare your slides, all these things, but you don't know everything. So you may have to look for additional literature. You may have to look up publications, journal articles about specific topics, or you may have to read another textbook to sort of get more knowledge so you can teach well. So that is very, very intellectually stimulating, right? That you get to learn things all the time. And I do learn new stuff all the time. And I find that very, very stimulating. Added to that is the fact that students will ask you questions about things you've never thought about. And that's not a negative, that's a positive, that's super cool. But every course I teach, there's at least one student who's going to ask me at least once, but usually multiple times, about things I have never thought about. I understand the concept, at least I thought I did, I understand the topic, and then he or she asks something like, oh yeah, but what about, and then I think, I have never ever thought about this that way. And then at that point, there are 2 things you can do. You can try to make up an answer on the spot, or you can say, and that's what I typically do, that's a really good question. I don't know. I think it might be this, but I'm going to look into this, and next class I'll come back to you and I'll give you your answer. I think that is more, I think that's nicer than trying to make something up on the spot, which may well be nonsense, because let's be fair, people also know if you're making something up on the spot that doesn't make sense. And I think that is the most respectful way to handle that. But that does mean that you have to be able to stand in front of a classroom and say, I don't know this. And some people find that very difficult. They think that if they, I think especially beginning educators think that they have to know everything, but you can't, right? So it's fine to admit, I don't know this, but let me look into it and I'll come back to you. And students appreciate that, typically, right? But that's very intellectually stimulating too, because they ask you questions that you have never thought about. Like, I'm serious, like you've never thought about that. So you get to learn even more, which is really cool. And I really love that. The second thing that I really enjoy about this job is that it's very social. Teaching is difficult because on the one hand it is very social, on the other hand it's very antisocial. Let's start with the negative. Antisocial. Why? Well, if it's term paper time and I'm teaching 4 courses, then worst case scenario I could have term papers from 4 times about 40 students coming in. That's a lot of term papers that I have to read and provide feedback on in a limited amount of time, to meet deadlines, to be able to submit final grades. That's a lot of work. And there are moments you basically lock yourself into your office and you just read. All day you are reading papers from students and you're grading. And that's pretty antisocial. But most of the time it's very social because you see colleagues. Again, this is very specific to my college, so I won't spend too much time on this, but my college is set up in such a way that I have neighbors, office neighbors from all kinds of disciplines. So I have a historian, another psychologist, an anthropologist, an English instructor, a philosopher, and then we had another someone from justice studies, and we had someone who taught French, all in the same little office space. I'm used to situations where you have psychology, and all your office neighbors are psychologists, which is a lot of fun too. Well, I specifically like that about this college because I have interdisciplinary discussions all the time. I'll come back to that. So that's very social. You have coffee with each other and you do things. It's very intellectually stimulating too, because these are all people from different academic fields, many with PhDs, so they're very intelligent people, and you have super stimulating conversations about things, which is really nice. But beyond that, there's also the students. Teaching in a classroom is a social affair because you're interacting with people. They ask questions, you respond, you have discussions, right? But beyond that, you also see the students because at the end of the class they may come up to you and ask questions, or they come into your office and they ask questions, right? So you deal with students a lot. And the fun thing about that is, this was the third point I had, it's a very rewarding job, and that ties in exactly to what I was saying. Because you're teaching these students, you are helping them progress on the path towards whatever it is they want to do. I'm a psychologist, so many of my students want to become psychologists. But we have service courses, so introductory psychology also has to be taken by other people. For example, nursing students, right? They have to take intro psych. So they take that too. So they have a different career path. They have a completely different thing in mind, right? But you interact with all of them. And that is very social, and it's very rewarding to see them grow. Now, I work at a very small institution, but I have worked at much bigger institutions, and there you see the same thing. I remember teaching a student when I was working on my PhD who took a second-year bachelor's course with me. I taught something in cognitive neuroscience. And then later, she became a master student, and she did her research, like her internship, in our lab. And then she wrote a master's thesis in our lab. So she went from a second-year bachelor student to a graduate student, and like we sort of kept in touch, right? Because I was supervising her work in the lab as she was working on her master's. I was responsible for, along with my supervisor, but grading her master's thesis. And later I became a referent for her. Like when she was applying for jobs, at some point someone called me to talk about her because she had applied for a PhD position. So what I'm trying to say is you get to see that development in your students, and that is amazing. That I find one of the most rewarding aspects of this job. You get to see people grow academically, but also as persons. Think about it. You come into college, 17, 18 years old, many of them, right? It's a whole new world. This is like different. It's not high school anymore. This is like a whole new situation and different place and different people and different instruction, and everything's different. So often there is a bit of anxiety, right? And a little bit of uncertainty of what's going on here. And then you can just see the confidence build, and you see them grow academically. And that is, in my mind, one of the greatest things ever, that you can see that journey. And when they leave, one of my favorite things, like a convocation where people get their diplomas and you get to shake their hands. And especially in a smaller institution, as I said, where I am, you get to see people grow. You see them come in as first-year students, you see them leave with a bachelor's degree. And that's absolutely amazing, right? Because you have been part of that journey, that intellectual academic journey, which I think is fantastic. Another thing that I really like about this job is that there is the potential for interdisciplinarity. I think it is very important to not stick to just your academic niche, but to look across the borders of your niche. In my case, psychology. But one of the courses I got to teach was called social gerontology, which was taught with a nurse. So there was a nursing instructor and there was a psychology instructor. And this nurse, of course, had all the knowledge of all the physiological systems in your body, what happens to them as you grow older. And I had the knowledge of the brain and of cognition. Fantastic collaboration. Fantastic collaborations. Also, I love working with nurses. I've done that for my PhD research as well, because nurses get stuff done. If you're a nurse, if you know a nurse, you know what I'm talking about. No nonsense. Stuff gets done, which I love. So all praise to nurses. Now, it's not just nursing. I mean, it's all kinds of things. I had this in my PhD as well. You collaborate with all kinds of people. We had the neuroanatomist and a pharmacologist and psychiatrist, etc. So that interdisciplinarity, I think, is a fantastic thing. And it will improve your teaching if you understand a little bit more about different fields as well. It's very important. And again, this ties into what I said. Our college is set up in such a way that my office neighbors are people from all kinds of different disciplines. So I have interdisciplinary discussions on a regular basis. And that is really cool, right? That's really neat. And sometimes, if you know my channel, you know that I do videos on Stoicism. At some point, those were picked up on by one of the philosophy instructors from our college. And he said, I think you know more about Stoicism than I do. Could you do a guest class on this and that, Stoicism, etc.? Yes, beautiful, right? And that's fantastic. That's really neat to have those kinds of interdisciplinary connections and interdisciplinary approaches to your work. And I find that very rewarding. Because the world is so complicated that I don't think you can just study that from one academic niche. I think you need to look at different things. Maybe that's just me. The fourth thing I wanted to say was research. So my main activity is teaching, but we also do research, right? And we're also expected to do research. Some of that is solitary research by itself, but for us, a lot of that research is the supervision of students doing research, and that's fantastic. What I really like about that is that you get to supervise students who have done, in my case, psychology is an empirical science, so they have done the research design courses, they have done the research methods, they have done the statistics, but now they get to actually put it into practice. That's amazing. And you get to supervise that. So you get to set up an experiment or some sort of study with them, plan it out, they find their participants, often in our case with community partners. They run the experiment, they do the analyses, they typically need a bit of work, a bit of help with that because it's the first time they do this. These are bachelor students. They write up the entire report, right? They write up the whole thing. It's amazing. And you get to supervise that, and then that will become research output. Like that will be presented at a conference, or it will be put in a paper, preferably both. So you get to do that. So you still, even for us, I say even for us because our mandate is so much on teaching, there still is research output. So you still get to do research. You may have to be a bit creative about how you do that with students, but you can do it. And that is really neat as well. Because in my mind, research and teaching really go hand in hand. You need to at least have done research to be able to teach at that level. And then your research can inform your teaching, and your teaching can inform your research. So that's, I think, is a really, really nice way to look at things. I also had to think of, this is the last positive aspect, then we'll get into a couple of maybe less positive aspects of this type of job. I had to think of our PhD. In our PhD ceremony at the university where I did it, you were handed your PhD, like the actual diploma in a cardboard tube. And your supervisor, it's a standard formula, says, revere her as an honorable distinction and a well-earned privilege, but never forget the obligations she imposes on you towards science and towards society. I think that's a really beautiful way to look at things. So I always try to keep that in mind. You have to do a certain level of research. You are doing this teaching. What obligations do you have towards students? What obligations do you have towards society? What do you want them to learn? For me, what's very important is that they learn to think as a scientist. Learn to think in as objective a way as they can. Learn to think in such a way that they learn to separate pseudoscience from science. It's a long path, but very interesting and very rewarding. So that to me is that obligation. And it's magnificent that you can actually do that in a job like this. Okay, what are some of the downsides of this kind of job? I think the biggest issue is that there is a lot of uncertainty. And it's not easy to get a job like this, and it's not easy to get a tenured position where you're actually hired permanently. This is not just applied to academic teaching. It definitely also applies to academic research. In my field, it's very common. You need to have a PhD for sure, but then you need to do a postdoc or 2 or 3. 3 postdocs. Typically ranging between 1 and 5 years in duration. 5 years not so common. Usually I would say between 1 and 3 years. You're expected to do 1 or 2 or 3. And only then can you start to apply as an assistant professor. And the competition will be huge. So it's very hard to get into academia. And all kinds of things will matter. Your academic network, your supervisor. One of the jobs of supervisors as they become more senior is to take a little bit of a back seat sometimes and to gently nudge forward their PhD students, their postdocs, so that they will have career opportunities. That's difficult. So don't expect that, for example, you would do a PhD and the next year you have a tenured position. It's more likely at this point, I would say, that a decade passes before you're there. And that's a very long time. And that's really something you have to be able to handle, because it's very difficult. You go from contract to contract, from place to place. You may have to move around a lot within a country, between countries. It's very hard, and that's something you really have to be able to handle, and that's difficult for some people. It's not the type of job where, say, I'm not saying this, I'm making this up on the spot, but for example, you have done all your training to become a plumber, and then you're a plumber and you're done, and you can just start a plumbing company, or you can work for another plumber, that's it. Or you study law, you take the bar exam, you are a lawyer, and you can just practice law and you're set. It's not like that in academia. It's much more uncertain, and that really is something you have to be able to handle. The second thing I would say is, at times this is a job that can be very bureaucratic. It does involve a number of meetings, and you're expected to be present at those meetings, which means you may also have say in the governance of an institution, which is really cool, but it is like a meeting every X weeks, right? There are different committees, and you're expected as an academic to be part of a number of committees for your work, and that's what you will be evaluated on. You have to make certain contributions to your institution, and again, you will be evaluated on that, and if you don't do that, that can be grounds for problems down the road. So you're expected to invest in those things, and to be honest, you often don't get course releases or something. So you're teaching your X courses. Again, I'm talking about college professorship. You're teaching your X courses, but you also have to do all your grading and your course prep and be in committees and supervise student research, which more often than not is also something you kind of do voluntarily and you don't get course releases for, which I'm not complaining about, but I sometimes feel that people have this idea that college professors have an ideal job because they work like 5 hours a week. No. If I teach 4 courses, okay, typically we have 2 classes a week for each course at 80 minutes. That's my classroom time. Then there is preparation time for the courses. I need to read the textbook. I need to do additional readings. I need to prepare the slides. I need to make sure that I'm as much of an expert as I can be in those specific fields. I need to go to all my departmental meetings. I need to supervise students' research. I need to do community service type things, that whatever is required. So maybe I have to give a public lecture somewhere, or maybe I have to do, because I'm also expected to do those kinds of things. So it's not it's just like a 10-hour work week. No. And when it's grading time, it could be an 80-hour work week, right? Because you have, like, if you have a stack of papers this high to grade, it needs to be done. And more often than not, in the evenings. Now, I love doing that, so it's not an issue, but I think that sometimes is a misunderstanding. So there is that. At times it is bureaucratic. Like, it's not just the meetings, it's also arranging things. There's a lot of emails. For example, students have accommodations. They may have more time to write tests. Of course, they're entitled to that time, right? But that means that for a student who has those accommodations, I'll be notified, exam is coming up. I have to approve that student has, it's my institution, but I have to approve that student has accommodations. That's okay, this is fine with me, right? And of course it is, why wouldn't it be? But then I have to indicate, what type of exam is it? Can they use a calculator? Can they use a cheat sheet? Is it open book? Tick, 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 takes time, right? I have to upload the exam to a server so that the test center has that and they can give it to that student. All of this is part of my job. Again, I'm not complaining, but that's 5 minutes, right? And then you may have 10 students like that in your course. Well, maybe not 10 students. You may have 5 students like that in your course, depending on how big the course is. You may have 10 students like that in your course. which is fine. They're entitled to those accommodations, right? I'm not sort of arguing that. But as an instructor, you have to deal with certain of those kinds of things, and that can become a bureaucratic thing, right? Which again is just part of your job. I'm just saying, like, that is something you have to spend time on. Anything else to say about that? I don't think so. Final thing I wanted to say is this is the type of job that really has peaks and troughs in your busyness. Because there are times during the semester where you have done your preparation and you're sort of preparing a bit for each class and you teach the class and that's it. But then it's midterm time or final time or term paper time. And of course you can try to plan your term papers in such a way they don't all come in on the same day. But last term I had 2 sections of statistics and 1 section of brain and behavior. And I had planned the tests for those sections on the same day. But that's like 3 times 40 students. That's a lot of students. I had not thought about the fact that some of the same students would take both courses. So I gave them 2 tests on the same day. And that made me feel bad. So this is something I try to keep in mind for next time, because it's a little harsh to make them write 2 tests on the same day. But it's the way it was. That sucks on their end. I have 120 tests to grade that all have come in on the same day. And the students are waiting for their grades. So I try to grade them as soon as I can. But that's a peak in busyness, right? Then, right before the tests, especially if you have a more difficult course, like in statistics, for example, or brain behavior, right before the tests, all kinds of students will want to come by because they have a number of questions, which is fine. That's my job. But at that time, I can easily have my 2 classes a day that I teach and spend almost the rest of the day talking to students in office hours because they all have questions, which is fine, again, but that's a peak in busyness, right? And then after that, it tapers off because then we have a couple of weeks till the next midterm or till the final, and then everything tapers off and you have a few people coming in for office hours. So what I'm trying to say is you have to be able to handle that and be able to plan these things in such a way that you don't perish in the peak busyness. And that's something you have to learn to strategize for. And you will. And because if you don't, then that's not the job for you, and you won't be able to do it. Like you will be stressed out. So you will, but it's something you have to learn. And it becomes easier the more you do it. Overall, best job I ever had. #Fury. But honestly, best job I ever had. I love this. When I wake up in the morning, honestly, I cannot wait to get to work. It's a pandemic right now, a little difficult, but you know what I mean. I can't wait because I love it. I love being in the classroom. I love interacting with students. I love interacting with my colleagues. I love that I get to learn all this new stuff, and it's fantastic and it's beautiful and it's wonderful. And I'm absolutely in love with this. I would recommend it to everyone as a career. Just bear in mind those things that I've gone over. That's what it's like. So for me, a regular day, I typically teach 2 classes a day. I answer a lot of emails, may have a meeting or 2, have some office hours. It's fantastic. And at the end of the day, I feel very satisfied because I've been able to talk to people, teach people things, help them on their journeys in academia. And that's one of the greatest things ever. So, this was about half an hour. That's what I was kind of expecting. If you've stuck with me till the very end, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this was of interest to you. And if you have any questions, by all means, put them in the comments and I'll try to respond as much as I can. Thank you very much. I'm glad to see you later. Bye-bye.